Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Dean and Chapter of Westminster, a very warm welcome indeed to the Lady Chapel, warmer than the ambient temperature at least, and to this dialogue as part of our Westminster Abbey Institute series. I'm Bishop Anthony Ball. I'm one of the canons here at Westminster Abbey, a member of the steering group of the Institute, and also your host for this evening. We have two fantastic speakers for this, the third in our series of dialogues on the theme of healing. Last week, we heard about the challenge of healing the planet, a little thing, and the week before about healing society. This week, we face perhaps the most fundamental challenge of all: how to heal ourselves. So it's fantastic and a delight for me and indeed for all of you, although I say it in anticipation, to have two eminently qualified speakers to help us this evening reflect on that theme. Dr. Alison Wood is a Fellow of Homerton College, Cambridge, and Academic Director of the Homerton Changemakers. And the very Reverend Sarah Rowland Jones is the Dean of St David's Cathedral in Wales. You have the biographies on the seat, and I'm not going to take up the time for dialogue by singing their praises. But if you haven't already read them, do take the time afterwards. For now, Alison and Sarah.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to Dean and Chapter of Westminster Abbey and specifically the Institute for inviting us to come along here. I have to say, this place is a little bit more bling than my own cathedral, but as any of you know, if you've visited St David's, we have our own charms on the most westerly, windswept, wild, windy peninsula of Wales. What we're going to do is that each of us are going to set out a broad overview, in a sense, a bit of the theory of how we approach it all, and then we're going to have a dialogue between us, because when we found we've only met by Zoom previously, but we found that we just sparked off each other, and I hope that we will be able to do that now and share that thinking aloud together with all of you, and then we will be taking questions from about 7:15, I think. So here I am, and the CV is on your seats. But 25 years ago, I was busy making the transition roughly from where some of you are sitting to wearing one of these. And it's lovely to see old friends, including from my time in the Foreign Office, people who were not surprised, I don't think, when the Monty Python finger of God came down and said, "Time for a move." And off I went. But so here I am in St David's now, and much of what I want to share this evening is actually things that I wish my younger self had known. Things about how to live a more joined up life, healthier, perhaps mentally and emotionally healthier in many ways, how to be more integrated, more grounded, confident sense of self, so that engaging with the stressful asks of life, whether personal or in work, I was doing it more out of my better self, off the front foot, rather than off the back foot. I don't think I'm really going to try and give answers per se tonight, because first of all of us are very different. The circumstances we find ourselves in are different, and life moves on and presents us with fresh challenges. So it's more about my attempt to ask better questions of myself in order to have a more adequate steering through the unfolding business of life. And I will unashamedly draw on Christian tradition in all of this. the metaphors of Scripture and the last 2,000 years, because this is the foundation of my being and has been since I was in my teens, and certainly on the grounds of those years of experience. It seems to me that it works. It works as a way to construe the world and our own place in it. And yet there are so many resonances, as we found when we were talking together, with other perspectives around such questions are, what is the meaning of life and how shall we pursue it? But I'm also going to say I think it works because it gives one access to that transcendent mystery of God's presence among and within his people by the power of the Spirit. It's as though Scripture is like the user's manual for life, but actually what we need to do continually is to go in and have the Maker give us a good servicing and to sort us out and help us do the right thing, because God's purposes are that we should live a healed or an ongoing life of receiving healing, that we can bear that light of optimistic hope in a world that often bears so many wounds because of the nature of how we live in time and space, the human condition and our capacity just to get things wrong or just to rub up against one another because we have so many different personalities, characteristics, experiences. And I could quote the famous poem by Philip Larkin about what our parents do to us, but I won't mention the verb in this space, so we just pass it on through the generations. Hurt people hurt people. But I'm going to talk next about, in order to discuss healing ourselves, we really need to have some sense of what we understand by being healthy, or indeed what it is to be unhealthy. And I'm going to place this in the bigger context of God's intentions in creation and redemption, summed up, I guess, in John's Gospel, words of Jesus saying, I came that you might have life in all its fullness, life in abundance. That's John 10:10. Abundant life, flourishing, the flourishing of individuals in flourishing relationships, flourishing communities, flourishing society, and a relationship of flourishing sustainability with the wider world as a whole. And I love that word, flourishing, because it's not like a narrow definition of success in a particular way. I think that flourishing can embrace all our differentiated realities, whoever we are, at whatever stage of life, from the vulnerability of a baby to the fragility of illness, aging, we can still have a flourishing life. The disabilities that some people have, all of this can still be seen. My nephew, who is on the spectrum, he has a clear idea of what he wants to do in order to flourish. Even within our mortality, it doesn't rub up against it. And there is no temptation, I think, to see some people as less human than others. There are big resonances with the word in the Old Testament, especially for salvation, which lies behind the word for Jesus, of Joshua, Yeshua. The cognate meanings are linked with concepts of liberty, freedom, being untrammeled, having space to grow. And so in Christian terms, we are created for salvation and we are created for flourishing, to live as God intends. And one of the things that I found really helpful in pondering this across the whole spectrum of human existence, I think, is to go back to one of those gotcha moments in the gospel where someone said to Jesus, what's it all about really? What does it all boil down to? And he said there are two great commandments: to love the Lord your God with heart and soul and mind and strength, and to love your neighbour as yourself. That sense of flourishing should encompass our hearts, our emotional life, our minds, our intellectual, our mental life, our souls, our spirits, that dimension, and strength, our physicality, our material well-being. And there's the neighbour side, because we are created to be individuals in relationship with others. And so there should be a flourishing in the way that we can engage with others. And I want to set against that. So keep that matrix, that's the sort of the one way down, those 5 things: heart, mind, soul, strength, relationship. But what about flourishing versus unflourishing, that trammelled, diminished sense of self? Luke's gospel, immediately after the temptations, Jesus comes to the synagogue in Nazareth, picks up the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and reads out what is, in a sense, his manifesto for the ministry ahead. He says, I came to bring good news to the poor, freedom to the oppressed, sight to the blind, liberty to captives, and proclaim God's favour. And actually what I find is that when one looks at life, whether it's policy decisions or one's own personal choices, you can think about good news to the poor. If I do this, will I be impoverished? Or who will be impoverished? Intellectually, spiritually, relationally, physically, all of that. Where are the blind spots in all of this? Who is constrained, oppressed, or held captive? Who is given opportunity? So, for example, if you're talking about policies, if you're closing libraries, you could say that impoverishes community gathering. It impoverishes intellectual life, and especially for those who don't have access to books and other resources, computer terminals, whatever. You might all think about gated communities. Those people clearly are not impoverished in many ways, but are they emotionally and relationally because of the way that they're cut off from that full breadth of society? You can think about it in terms of public transport or housing or environment. But what we're going to do this evening is move that much more into talking about ourselves. There's no one size fits all. So I'm hoping that what I'll be doing is sharing resources. And talk about the ways that at different times we may need to privilege one or privilege another in order to deal with the circumstances that we live through. But I'll talk about that in a minute, I think. And we'll also talk and reflect together, I think, on how you actually are attentive to all of these dynamics in your inner and outer life, and then what you can do in order to put the focus on where attention is needed and how to take things forward from there. I think I'm going to stop there for now and let Alison give her introductory comments, and then we'll take it from there together. So, Alison.
Thank you, Sarah. Sorry, I'm still warming up. That might not be possible, but that's all right, because the spirit of this conversation is very warm indeed. So, because I'm an academic, I'm going to, of course, ask us to first settle on our terms. Sarah has introduced us to the idea of thinking attentively and with awareness that is both micro and macro, about our selfhood and about what wholeness and health looks like. I'm going to ask, first of all, what do we really mean by healing? And I'm not going to take my glasses off at you and nod, but have a think about what comes to mind for you when you think about healing. Something around restoration and healthfulness or return to former wholeness might come to mind. You might be someone who thinks of functionality, that a healed arm or a healed finger is something that is able, fully functional. We talk a lot in our current embattled moment about psychosocial healing, spiritual healing, the healing of energy. For some people, healing is about a certain presence of joy or even wisdom or the absence of pain. More technically, and I know there are some medics in the room, healing might be a return or a recovery from trauma or of a crisis, injury, wounds, betrayal, a recovery at least of function, if not perfection, of a painful rupture to the skin or the structure or the presence of an organism. And for me, sometimes there's something about healing that is reminiscent of recovering from the flu, or if you had COVID, you were isolated, wan, and sorry. And eventually your strength recovers and you're allowed to emerge outside, and you might feel a kind of lightness of being because you've been restored. Something in you is allowed out again into the light. So here there are many facets of what we maybe have in mind when we think about healing. For me, there's also something sage-like and mysterious built into this word, that healers are ancient members of our tribes. And not everybody really understands what healers do, but they understand the effects. Part of my current job, which I'll get to in just a moment, I've been asked to talk about Changemakers tonight. Part of my job is to read really rubbish books so that other people don't have to. And we are at a moment, I think, where the self is desiring healing. And it always has desired healing, but we are turning to the coach, the sage, the provocateur, and the entrepreneur to help us understand how we heal ourselves. So let's turn to the second term, because I'm still being my academic self. What do we mean by ourself when we talk about healing ourselves? I'm going to suspect, I do suspect, that most of us have an idea of the self being an entity that has an identity that moves in and through the world mostly self-determinately, with some outlier exceptions around oppression and incarceration and true constraint. We tend to accept, I think, in our current moment, that large-scale forces, politics, money, gender, race, will press onto this self, and those things will alternately celebrate or oppress or enable or disable that self. They will constrain or challenge or shape that self. But I think the overwhelming idea, particularly in contemporary European and North American thought, is that the self is an individual rooted in identity and the expression of that identity. It is somewhat porous, we accept, but mostly I think we tend to think of it a bit like an orange or a beach ball. You know, discrete, many facets, mostly self-curated with these forces attending. In the context of our conversation tonight, we might also think about a broader self, healing ourselves as institutions. Healing, dare I say it, Westminster, not here, Whitehall, Cambridge. Claire asked me tonight to think about healing in relation to something I do at Cambridge, which has run a rather innovative and pioneering program, but I would say that because I founded it, called Changemakers, which is a program that sits alongside a student's degree and attempts to make more visible the things that wouldn't ordinarily be made visible in that degree process. An awareness of oneself and one's formation, of course, but an ideal that that self could transform through encounters with ideas and experiences and others into a self that is less fear-driven and less ego-riddled, more able to be able in the world. Changemakers for me is the most recent part of a 20-year career thinking about what universities are for and what they really ought to do, particularly in the current climate we find ourselves in, of climate crisis, of geopolitical tension and collapse. It's built on the idea that if all of us, and so my cohort here is Cambridge students, some of whom are here tonight joining us, the model is self, society, world. With a degree of knowledge and wisdom in each of those zones, falsely delineated as they are, and some expertise and capacity to move between those zones, the theory goes that we can change systems for the good. But we can't change systems without that core of attentiveness, of well-being, of wholeness, although I don't know that wholeness is ever attainable actually. I think that's one of the modern myths, but of ability at least. And I would argue love. One of the things we do is we help, I think, and students can tell you if I'm right or not, we encourage students to ask better questions of themselves and of other people. Okay, so that's Changemakers, and you can look at our website if you want to know more about the details. I'd like to spend the next few minutes, in a moment of challenging some of our categories of self and of healing. So let's start with this definition that I set out earlier, which you can agree with or not and violently contest later, and we will welcome that. But if we understand modern selfhood as a distinct entity, then healing is going to look like a restoration of that structure, right? The structure of that self. It somewhat implies that there is an ideal, whole state to which we can return, or if you want to be a bit more sophisticated about it, to which we will evolve and transform. And in some ways that's exactly right. Our bodies and our consciousness are bounded, rather like that orange. So to be healed does mean individual flourishing. And to be in the process of healing means transformation and growth and repair and reconciliation. But unlike the orange, or perhaps actually like the orange, depending on how you look at it, as it falls and grows and decays, our bodies and consciousnesses are always and deeply affected by relations. I'm just echoing something you've said already, Sarah. By these relations with spaces and ideas and people, and stimulus and experience, we are not fixed points, but in flux. So another way to look at the idea of ourself is that not only are ourselves deeply and intimately interconnected with others, we exist only in relation to the existence of other forms and environments and material. And this is where I think it really starts to mess a bit with our minds, if we take this concept quite a long way. You might have come across the Maori philosopher Karl Mika, and he writes about a wonderful notion called weldedness, which is that for Maori encounters and understandings of the world, I exist not only in relation to you, or to this built environment, or to this city, or even to the earth, on which we have layers of stone and tile and out there tarmac, but I exist because of those relations. I am described and formed and inscribed by those countless connections with all that exists. And so without those relations, part of me ceases to exist. It's that fundamental. So where this takes us, if we think about healing, is that to be healed is to restore or craft or invite full and wholehearted relations. And not only with our concept and experience of ourselves, but with beyond human and non-human systems. It's not partial, it's whole. Now, because I am an Australian and a pragmatist, I want to suggest two ways that we could actually start to take the idea of weldedness fully and live that. And if this all sounds unhelpfully abstract, then let's turn to the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who frankly is also known for being a little bit abstract. But we're going to see if we can tie these two ideas of weldedness and of Buber into the language that we use as a way to think and experience more deeply what I would call whole system thriving, whole system flourishing. You might know that Buber, in his work I, Thou, wrote that when we speak of ourselves in relation to another as I, it, we set ourselves apart a little bit from that other, a person, a tree, a nation. And the other's reality exists only in relation to our own orbit, if you like. When we speak I, Thou, or I, you, where thou means a fully complex, ineffable entity, just as interesting and intricate as I am, we are immediately present and we exist in relationship with no claim to knowing the other necessarily, but in reality we are together. So we have but equal reality. It sounds simple. But if we move from I, it to I, thou, there are radical implications for how we think about and experience healing. When we say I, it, the I exists to observe the it over there. But when we say I, thou, the I changes. It is the very act of speaking the thou that changes the I. To put it in Buber's words, all real living is meeting. So I'm not going to say it's all about the pronouns because we'll end up in a cul-de-sac. What I want to say is it's all about the naming. To put it another way, Robin Wall Kimmerer's beautiful meditation, Braiding Sweetgrass, on earth and humans being good medicine for one another, offers this way of looking at it, that names are the way we humans build relationships, not only with each other, but with the living world. So we may actually start to enact this process of healing by thinking very attentively and with this awareness of the names that we use and the fact that we don't exist as discrete entities. We exist only because of the existence of other forms. Okay, one second practical thought here before we go on to our conversation. I've been reading Maggie Nelson recently, her new book on freedom. And she writes that freedom often looks like a future achievement, a goal out there that we can strive for and struggle for and fight for. And we rightly fight and struggle. But she argues that whilst the emancipatory, liberatory views are vital to help us imagine and desire a better state of being, a better world, and we might bring to mind here anything from the civil rights movement to the rightly aggressive pursuit of climate harmony, she reminds us that freedom is not in fact an end state or even a moment in time. It is a practice. It is a process. It is a series of habits, modes, daily actions and structures and invitations. And here Nelson quotes the theorist and brilliant writer around democracy, Wendy Brown, whom I had a chance to carry coffee for once. She is pretty good. That the freedom to self-govern is actually sober, exhausting and without parents. To quote. Sober, exhausting and without parents. That is a really challenging image to contend with, but for Nelson, that feels like a much more workable approach than, to quote, the big night of liberation. Rather, it's what's happening the morning after, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. And I think we could look at healing in the same way. Not an endpoint, but a practice. And not generally a big night of liberation or restoration, but what happens the morning after and the morning after that. These processes, for me, are incremental and exhausting, and empowering and loving, and sometimes unpredictable and always interconnected. But to come back to the idea that healing is a series of processes and practices, not all of which we are in command of, and this is at a cellular level or a social level or a political level, I think this invites us to say that we might not gaze on ourselves or the world in order to fix things, or even to hope for a self or a world that meets our expectations. Perhaps, and now I might be referring to some Buddhist philosophies, or I might not, perhaps our task is to face our selfhood and to face the world we are in with wise and compassionate gazes, adopting a posture that is ready to encounter what is actually unknowable and uncontainable, and yet we can bring to that a commitment to the daily task of staying present with these new vocabularies of weldedness, of I, thou, and of an understanding that healing is practice, process, and habit. So,
wow, we've got all sorts there that we can get our teeth into between us. I would like to pick up one particular theme that I saw running through, or heard running through that. Perhaps the practice and the ongoing process and the realistic expectations in each moment, and the way that you said, I don't think that there is an actual wholeness, that we're actually going to get to. And I think that one of the real trickinesses of current living is that somehow we're always reaching for something that beyond, and find it really hard to live in the present moment. And I want to relate to what you were saying about that sense of self, because you talked about healing as perhaps restoration, but when I look back on my life, I think that it's been a trajectory that I'm not quite sure that there's ever been a going back to something, unless it was the sort of, I can remember about being 4 or 5 years old, coming home on the bus and contemplating the way that my mother related differently to me, to my younger brother, and having deep existential questions about self and who I was supposed to be and how I was supposed to live, because I felt that she was demanding different things of me than she was of him. And so perhaps it's even since then I can see there's been a wrestling. And where do we get our sense of self from? I mean, my sense is that is a shifting target. When I was growing up, so much of the discourse was about actually sort of digging down into yourself and uncovering the jewel that was there. You had to explore and find yourself. And being of the generation that I am, that sort of vocabulary still works for me. But talking with some of my colleagues who research in the interface of theology and philosophy, which is where I tend to hang out a lot, they say that particularly through the influence of the whole media, advertising, marketing thing, the younger generation, and some of you will have to tell us whether I've got this right or not, are much more used to the language of seeing the self as a brand to be built and to be sold, that we become curators of ourselves and project it. Now, I'm conscious that actually those two sit together not very easily. And I'm looking there at a former ambassador and thinking about my own time in the Foreign Office and aware that so many people in their working lives have a requirement to act and behave in particular ways, to give certain messages, to present a particular face to the public in their working life, which may or may not be consonant with what's going on in one's deep interior self. I mean, I was fortunate that I left the Foreign Office before I would have felt inclined to resign over this, that, or the other. I hope I would have had the courage to do so, but who can tell? But what's your sense of that tension that there can often be of external pressures, perhaps from our growing up or perhaps from our work, to be one thing, and then the dialogue that we have with our inner being saying, well, who am I really? I'm not just the person who jumps through the hoops that my parents, my teachers, my employers put in front of me, but who am I really?
Well, that's a minor question, isn't it, really? Sarah, who are we really? I've often wondered whether there's something about modernity where you're mostly defined by your work and or status that you've mostly generated through hard work and education, whether that means that our self actually is really about a set of external factors. And I'm contrasting that with I wouldn't want to call it a pre-modern understanding of the self, but a differently grounded understanding of the self, that which family I was born into, which place I lived in, my relationship with that particular place, but my virtues as well, my character, formed the world's understanding of myself, and possibly my understanding of myself. And the old-fashioned understanding of virtue or of good could be brought into this conversation. Something really powerful has shifted where we are now, sort of almost co-located strangers in the pursuit of work. Which means that, and that's not mine, but I can't remember who said that, so I'll just have to cite the anonymous source. But what that means is that selfhood has a different set of pressures to bear. Not only around self-curation made possible by hyper-communication in various media forms, but our own desire to actually be a well-curated self. So, to look back with our catalogue of what an interesting life is, and to be able to say we did it, even with really noble intentions. So in a way, we are being crafted by our moments. And I think being aware of that might mean that there's room now for this somehow ineffable pursuit of the ineffable.
Yes, right. Yeah. Let me bring Jesus back into it. Because one of the things that helped me was to realise, I talked about Jesus after his temptations, the three temptations in the wilderness, to turn stones into bread. One can see that in terms of control of the products of Marxist thought, production and all that. It's about wealth, it's about riches, it's controlling one's resources. Or the second one about, if you bow down to me, all the nations says Satan, all the nations of the world will follow you. It's about that power. Or the third one, throw yourself off the pinnacle of Westminster Abbey and the angels will catch you before you hit the ground. To be the wonder worker, to be famous for being famous, to have status, but power and wealth and status, and how these are particularly pernicious elements if they become the goal in themselves, rather than saying, well, they're useful, you can achieve things through them, but I'm not going to allow myself to be defined and caught up solely into those things. That I'm aware of that game, but I'm not going to play it to the extent that actually it hollows out my inner sense of self. And it's really difficult, I think, to keep going back and pondering those things, and just being. Now, of course, I have. I can remember I came to a dinner here 2 years ago with Jamie, and I said to him, and I was sitting out next to him with an archbishop there, and I said, bloody hell, I've become a hierarch in the church. That one has to own seniority when it comes your way, but how are you going to live into the power, the influence, the status, the wealth that you have? The things that can be very good servants of ourselves and the wider world can also simultaneously be very bad masters. And we need to develop that reflectiveness to be aware of where the shifts are within us and what we're actually becoming victims of, even through our own practices, our own choices.
Can I ask you a question, Sarah? I was thinking a lot about what happens when one is under enormous pressure, suffering, and that sense perhaps of disintegration of various parts of yourself. Sometimes rapid transformation, I'm just thinking of Joanna Macy's work, where she writes brilliantly that rapid transformation often actually challenges our defences and our assumptions. And what's left is something a little bit other. And some people, I think, argue that you only find this gem through some process of suffering or through intense pressure. What do you think of that?
Well, I should talk about my first husband. I think that, and I shall misquote Isaiah terribly, because he talks about finding treasures of darkness, which doesn't quite mean this, but that sense that often in our hardest moments we learn lessons that we couldn't have learnt if we'd only ever lived on the sunny uplands. My first husband was a black South African bishop, or he was a dean when I first met him. I was 41. We got married when I was 42. No, we engaged when I was 42, married at 43, and I was widowed at 44. We found out 3 weeks before we were due to get married that he had smoking-related cancer. He had a lump in his tongue from decades of hanging with a pipe hanging round there. And that sort of devastation, because I had found singleness hard. Our society puts a lot of pressure on people to be in relationships. And I suddenly thought, in terms of the psalmist, that I had finally found my heart's desire. And then even before I had properly laid hands upon him, the cosmic sadist up there was going to take him away from me. And that sense of, well, what do you do with all of that? We married, and actually it was the happiest year and the worst year of my life, the 10 months and 3 weeks before he died. To go back to my little matrix, we put a lot of energy into the emotional and the spiritual and the relational. The material stuff, well, we just spent money to do the things that we wanted to do in the time that we had available to us. As for the intellectual, basically we were both praying brains on legs, so we theologized a lot together. But that sense of taking time out every morning, a big chunk, just to do nothing inside my head and let the emotions rise to the surface. If you read the Psalms, you can probably be quite shocked at the way that the psalmist is sometimes raves at God and is angry or despairing or at his wit's end. And it's that invitation to be honest before God about the totality of the negative stuff, not to be ashamed of it, embarrassed about it. In a sense, God knows anyway, so you might as well let him have it full on both barrels. And I can remember Justus saying, I'm not going to pray to be healed, he said. Because what if I don't get healed? Then I'll need God even more. But what if I say, I'm not going to deal with you unless you give me what I want? And so I'm just going to pray that thy will be done. And I thought about another verse which says, in all things God works for good. And so I decided that to get my head round how to deal with all of this, I was going to say, okay, God, your idea of good is bigger and better than any idea that I can have. And I'd come to that. That was a hard one. I'd done, Pope Francis, the Ignatian tradition, I'd done the 30 days full spiritual exercise. Someone like me managed to keep my mouth shut for a whole month of silent retreat, although every day I did meet with my spiritual director. But to realize that God's best, even if healing was not God's best, then God's best will be better. And somehow the liberation that we found, both of us, through not feeling that we had to be in control and masters of our fate, and if it didn't work out the way we wanted, then both of us had failed. Actually, to go with the process somehow, to acknowledge mortality, to acknowledge that sometimes life is too difficult. I can't control always what happens to me, but I have a fair amount of control over how I respond to it. And then really trying to take time to listen to the inner movements of my heart and soul and mind and all of that, and to honour that and work with it, and to be grounded in a sense, to look at the awful things face on, but actually then I wasn't hiding from any spectres or expending energy trying to keep the pressure cooker lid on. And actually we just spent all our time laughing together. We had a most amazing and happy time, even in the tragedy of it all. And some people here received my emails during that time, and you'll recall what it was like.
Thank you for sharing.
I'm going to tell another story. Yes, because it was a tough thing. I was in the British Embassy in Budapest when the Queen paid the first state visit to an Iron Curtain country. And I was the main coordinator of our team. And for the 3 months beforehand, we were working all day, every day, 5 days a week, 6 days a week. And in the last month, it was about 7 days a week. And I'd leave home about 8:30 in the morning and get home about 10 o'clock at night. And I'd just go straight upstairs and go to bed. And under the bed, I had a bottle of brandy. And I had a very small glass, so I'd have a small glass of brandy and keel over, and that was it. And this was a really excellent way to live for that final month. But actually, one of the things we were talking about when we discussed earlier is that it's good to have coping mechanisms in the short term, but to recognise what you're doing, name it, and don't carry on forever, because you may find that it becomes a ball and chain to flourishing further on. So as soon as the state visit was over, the bottle of brandy went back in the cupboard.
Very wise. Very wise. It's a very self-aware intervention, I think, Sarah. And maybe there's something there around this ability to observe oneself kindly. To bring this gaze of quite kind, compassionate observation, actually, that this will be really useful right now. And it's almost as though you suspend judgment of a certain kind, not sensibility, not sense, but being able to accept how things are in that moment and to do something that means you can be present, you can function. I think
one of the things that I learned was that God loved me. And that love from God, unlike some of the things that my mother had managed to transmit unintentionally, was that God's love wasn't conditional on my behaviour or on my achievements or anything like that. And it doesn't mean to say that the naughty stuff, the sin, doesn't matter. But it's like, parents don't stop loving 2-year-olds when they throw a tantrum. And it's in church, I sometimes get people to stand and say to each other in pairs, God loves you. And we can all say that to somebody else, and we can really mean it and look them in the eye. But then I say, okay, now say to your partner, God loves me. And we often, that's a bit difficult. It really shifts it. But actually to be aware that we are held in this remarkable, unconditional, unconditional positive regard, and that we can sit lightly to our own foibles in that sense. Be kind to ourselves, be generous, laugh, and be kind to others. I think quite a lot of what we've been talking about is the need not to take ourselves too seriously, because then we shrink ourselves in. So I think one of the other thing I learned is about, it's that thing about imagine your worst enemy in their pajamas when they're brushing the teeth in the morning. But the way that we tend to be so much aware of our crumbling and chaotic inner selves, and we're comparing ourselves with what appears to be the very polished and curated facade of somebody else who is like the swan, is paddling as hard under the water as we are, but we just can't see it.
We're all swans. That's what
we're
you're
all
saying.
swans.
We're all swans. Yes. Shall we have some questions?
Let's have some
now?
questions and see what else we can pick up in this. Okay, first question at the back there.
My name's Maria. I work in the Foreign Office. I work on Syria, and actually I'm about to do the 30 days exercises in January. So, a lot of your journey resonated, but thank you for sharing the full realities of that. I guess I wanted to pick up on your question about how young people, or my generation perhaps, understands the self. And I definitely have found both that idea of branding, that's actually quite big in the Foreign Office, but it seems to vary between what's your authentic self and what's the self that will kind of fit with what the organisation wants. At the same time, I notice a real desire amongst many of my peers for mindfulness, different spiritualities, different mental health techniques, and that is equally important for people and more talked about, which I think is very good. And I wanted to ask you actually about Ignatian spirituality, because it's something I discovered in the last 2 years and have found very helpful for healing and present living day to day. But anything else you wanted to share on that would be really interesting, Sarah, and feel free to.
Yes, because we haven't actually done much of the detail about the sorts of good habits and good practices that both of us think are at the root of trying to live a life that encourages that dynamic of healing and wholeness through all the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, all the hard stuff that comes our way. And for me, it is that prayerfulness. Both the offices, the morning and evening prayer, where there's a very set text and for each day to go through, because then that keeps me grounded in the big picture. But also to take time, and which I'm not so good at the moment because I'm doing a lot more in the offices because I hang out in a cathedral a lot. But that sense of taking a shorter passage of scripture and sort of sucking on it like a boiled sweet and letting the flavours emerge. And in fact, this morning, when I did my morning prayer on the train coming over from St. David's, and there was a bit in the psalm about the walking around the Jerusalem and counting its bulwarks and its towers and all of that, and the tension between are those towers and are those ramparts all about the power of the secular state, or are they all about the new Jerusalem, the holy Zion? And just sitting with that verse and thinking, that is the context in which we're coming here this evening to talk about, and to recognise that in a sense the two sit simultaneously. That's just an example. I hadn't expected to see it there. Ignatian spirituality is a big thing. There's a really good website, it's just, I think it's called ignatianspirituality.org or something. But it helps that sense of, I think the key thing is something called the examen of conscience, where you just sit down and take even 10 minutes a day and you quieten yourself through listening to your breathing. You're conscious that you're in the presence of God. And then you do a sort of a reflection through, whether it's the 24 hours or the last week or whatever. And you think about, where did I meet that flourishing? Where did I see love? Where did I see all the good things? Where's the God-shaped stuff, the redemptive stuff, the flourishing, the healing, the wholeness? And to be conscious of it and to be thankful for it. And then perhaps to review and think about where I did feel a nudge to say something, but actually I didn't. Or I felt a nudge to shut up and I went into the extra sentence, which was the showing off and the winning points and the self-gratification, and I should have listened to the nudge and next time, and to pray that one can then become more attuned, not merely to recognizing this sort of positive and negative tension within oneself in retrospect, but to be more attuned to it in the present moment. And again, I have found that that's something which is freeing, to step back from temptations of self-justification, to be able to recognize, well, if I step up here, can the angels of my better self speak? Or am I going to give in to the temptation just to score points and go play the ball, or no, play the man and not the ball? You know what I'm talking about. But I think finding some sort of daily or every few days or something capacity to do quiet listening to oneself is terribly important. And I would say doing it within that Christian context work, because it gives me anchors beyond myself riding my own little hobby horse around my own curated space.
What an image. I was thinking, alongside this, there's something for me in all of the great contemplative traditions from across cultures that eventually get you to the space where the idea is, and the practice is, to quieten the self, where the self then steps sideways so that you are more aware of what's real and you are more connected with what's real. So there's this tension, I think, here between, on the one hand, a very aware self that might submit itself to a discipline and a practice, and indeed might submit itself to love, and also long traditions of the self being actually disciplined to quieten, so that the existence is somehow beyond that awareness of self. The self still exists, but the awareness of that self isn't dominating the existence. And that paradox for me sits at the heart of many traditions, yes, including the Christian tradition.
Yes, it's almost as in letting go, you find yourself. If you strive too much to find yourself, actually you end up all sorts of dead ends and cul-de-sacs.
It's the spaces between notes.
Yeah, and it's like happiness. You can't pursue happiness per se as a thing, but if you're pursuing well-being and good around, you often discover that happiness has come upon you.
It's lovely. Unbidden.
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 Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Oh, there's one at the front here.
John, and then
one at the back there. Thank you.
Lady in the front.
Thank you. I'm John Wood, retired academic, but I have spent quite a bit of time seconded to running a research council and being an advisor to the European Commission on Research, so I know quite a lot of this. But Sarah, I was reminded that I actually preached on the Greatest Commandment 2 weeks ago, and one of the things that hit me was, how do you love God and your fellow men and yourself with your mind? And as an active researcher, my mind's always being dissatisfied. Every time I discover something, I'm dissatisfied. I'm never at rest. And that's one thing we found amongst my colleagues, that once we got a result, that was it. We've got to move on. And so that gave a sense of urgency, but also dissatisfaction, that you never actually got anywhere. And so we're like, as Alison knows, my focus is always on atoms that are vibrating. Always vibrating, trying to get outside the energy well. And so I just wondered if you had any comments or thoughts on that.
It's always seemed to me that loving is as much an act of the will as it is a warm and fuzzy feeling. And that in many ways I have found, particularly when loving one's enemies, that the thing to do is to create, through one's mind, the love-shaped structure to work out what can I do that is the loving thing in this context, so that God, in a sense, pours the love into the framework, that we haven't got to generate the feeling, but we work on honing the attitude and the actions that are consonant with it. I'm not sure if that really fits with the way that you framed the question, actually, but I'm seeing some nods around that people know what I'm talking about, but I don't know if it really answers your question. Is that?
No, sorry. That's okay. Is there something, John, in what you're saying about attentiveness? I mean, my academic career is built on discontent. I'm thoroughly discontented with this, so we're going to do this. And that's both in terms of ideas and conventional research and structure building. Well, that's not working, that's a terrible idea. But is there something around love and attentiveness that you can hold all of those things that you've dealt with, you've done it, but the love, I mean, I'm really interested in the relationship between love and research, for example. I'm beyond the passion narrative, but activating love. And if we activate it in the sense of caritas, there's sort of this great, profound love, which is not actually about any feelings of joy, but it's about this deep service. That in a way you might argue that an academic career based on discontent is an act of caritas. And so that the shape of the whole is this, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud here, it might be complete rubbish. But then again, there might be something in it around this attentiveness over a period of decades. Where the discontent fuels you onwards, but the act of attentiveness is in itself love.
Now that sparks off for
do you
me.
agree with that?
The moral philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who says that the ultimate question that human beings should pose is, how then shall we live? That the business of life is that corporate undertaking, and he's rooted in sort of Aristotelian pursuits of moral rationality, which he says are found through cultures of tradition, where basically you all argue together about what does it mean to be a human being and to flourish, and how do we move in that direction, the sort of eudaimonia of Aristotle. And in that sense, he says you can always ask, well, are things as good as they could possibly be? And the answer is always no. So you always have a trajectory, but that is, in a sense, a love-driven dissatisfaction, I think, because it is that desiring of better flourishing for all and sundry and the planet itself.
I think we had a couple more questions, Sarah.
Right.
One here,
There's
and
one
then
there,
someone
and then
in
one
the
there.
front as well.
Yes, if that.
Hi, thanks so much. My name's Emma Thomas. I'm a civil servant at UK Export Finance. I was hoping to pick up on a couple of themes that you've touched on. So one is about the relation between the self and the institution or organisation, and perhaps thinking about organisational or institutional flourishing. How, perhaps as a change maker or as desiring to be a change maker, can we bring others along with us? How can we affect that change and help the organisation flourish, especially where there are constraints placed on us which make that quite challenging to do?
Right. I think I hear you. I work in an organisation which looks like it hasn't changed in 800 years. But of course it has. It's changed all the time, and it prides itself on its resistance to change being a safeguard for its own excellence. So what do you do in this situation? How do you proceed when there are levers of change that are slow burning and slow going, when sometimes change is only possible through very senior roles and senior held mechanisms, and you have to make a deal with yourself about how many years you reckon you could do this before you're in a place to decide. And for me, one of the interesting things, and I'll use the history of the institution that I know, which is Cambridge and the universities, that major change points have happened throughout its history. And usually it's because small groups of people get together with varying riotous levels of discontent about what's going on. And it's small groups of people who understand the system with which they're in and use its apparatus, but they tweak it ever so slightly. They push it sideways, or they say, actually, it could do this instead. And it works with its own cultures of self-understanding, in Cambridge's case, excellence, steady achievement over centuries. And it works with the very vocabulary that keeps the institution whole, but revolutionises or transforms from within. And this has happened historically from, dare I say it, the admission of non-Anglicans into Cambridge. The radical adjustments
and girls.
I know, girls. The radical adjustment of the tripos, where a group of fellows suddenly realised that they really ought to take teaching seriously. that ought to be part of, John's shaking his head, that ought to be part of the mandate of the university. And always it was small groups of people who understood their influence and understood the tools at their hands, but used them for slightly different ends. And for me, that seems to be a thread, perhaps, that pertains to a lot of the institutions in which we work, that there are some personal requirements around demeanour, possibly restraint, possibly strategy, that are required, that can still cohabit with an authentic, fiery, enlivened, loving self. That those two things, those two worlds aren't mutually exclusive. But they have to be brought together wisely. And generally, I find it would be very difficult to do that alone. There is a community of practice that is constantly working with the tools of the organisation. And I'm making an assumption here that we're working with good tools. It's a different scenario, I think, when there's a culture or tools that are actively damaging or actively toxic. But let's just say we've got some good material to work with. That would be my perspective from thinking about an institution, possibly not unlike the civil service.
Yes, I can see it's very difficult depending on what the political demands are, which are often short-term and narrowly defined. And I think one of the pluses of the Foreign Office has been capacity, at least sometimes, to try and look at the long term and the wider picture. But no, I think to be if I were working in this part of the world now, I think that I'd find it quite constraining. And then one has to, I think, be careful about, in some ways it's better to be aware of how bad it is than pretend it's not. Oh, the question here at the front, please, right at the front.
Thank you. Alison Joyce, Director of St Bride's Church, Fleet Street. I want to pick up what you said about suffering and push it a bit harder. And I'm going to stray into the territory of crashing generalisations here, so forgive that. But the Christian faith is full of paradoxes, we know that. And one of the motifs that you can trace in different manifestations is that spiritual growth often accompanies physical disintegration in different kinds. You know, St Paul is knocked off his feet and deprived of his faculties at the moment of insight. And there are other manifestations of that, the whole notion that it's in our weakness that we actually encounter God. And I'm reaching the stage of life where my faculties are diminishing rapidly, and so I hope this will be a time of great spiritual growth. But I think the question I want to ask is physical wholeness and well-being an impediment to our deeper wholeness?
I suspect with a lot of these answers is, well, it can be, but not necessarily. But I know that when I was younger, I took for granted all sorts of things which I never should. Perhaps emotionally, we tend to think that we're invincible when we're sort of about 18, 19, something like that. No, I don't think it needs to be. Because I'm also thinking about the way that physical well-being, pilgrimage, walking, all of that can be a terribly important part of one's well-being. I think even during COVID, one of the good things that came out was people being encouraged to take an hour every day and go out and enjoy not just the sense of your own body and being in some sort of nature, even if it's only just a park or something like that. No, but I think what I would want to do is pick up where I thought your question was going to go right at the very beginning, when you were going to say suffering, because I wouldn't want people to take away the idea that suffering doesn't matter or that it's always the door to great insight, because actually it may just be deep and terrible tragedy, and some people may find that whether it's their own situation or the situation of others, that find very, very little redemptive hope in it. And then I think that the Christian tradition would be that we look to Jesus, who on the cross says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And therefore it's all right to feel completely and utterly God-forsaken. And I cannot guess what is happening in another individual's walk in their life with what they're about. But if God could go to that point of feeling forsaken by God's own self in the mystery of the inner dynamics of the Trinity, then perhaps the message is that in the darkest depths of human existence, some of which are beyond capacity to comprehend, then God is still there.
I think, Alison, something else came to mind for me. I must be in a playful mood tonight, because what's coming to mind is Vanessa Andreotti and a group of quite interesting academics and activists across Canada, some of whom are Native Americans. And they've put together something called Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures, a series of works, experiences, teaching programs, and all sorts of things. Why I say this is because whenever you sign up to one of the programs as part of this collective, they give you something called the Broccoli Agreement. And the Broccoli Agreement is a series of things that's a bit like eating your broccoli when you're a child and you really don't like eating your broccoli. And one of the things that you read, and you can agree to, is that you will give up that this experience will be something that you consume in order to make you better. And what this is a really powerful gesture towards the the self-centricity of our experience. And it invites students who are very well schooled in not only self-curation, but consuming all the things, academically, experientially, even being generous, consuming all the things to build a self that is somehow satisfying and that assuages the great epistemic and existential abyss. And it's asking to say, the suffering, the achievements, that's not actually about you. So it's just a different way of thinking about where we place our suffering and where we place ourselves. It doesn't deny that, but it's just asking us to be aware of how we might turn narratives constantly inwardly in a series of benefits and accruals that are actually quite capitalistic in their origins. And what happens if that self is far more diffuse and porous and networked in that moment of suffering?
Time is beginning to move on, so I'm going to suggest that both of us have a quick visual sift through our notes to see if there's any other final gems we want to toss in your direction. One that struck me was humility, that sense of because we are finite and our perspective is therefore incomplete and very specific, we're not going to know everything and know it all well. And a lot of what I do in my daily prayer is basically saying, Lord, where I've misunderstood, where I've got it wrong, if I'm heading in the wrong direction, just haul me up and dust me down and point me in a better one. I'm always turning to God to say, show me what the unknown unknowns are that I need to know in order to do better. And to be prepared to learn that sometimes I really have made very poor decisions through weakness, through ignorance, and through my own deliberate fault, as the confession might say. And any or all of those may come into it. So I think that was one thing. Another thing I was going to suggest is some people find journaling very helpful. That if you don't find silent prayer easy, although frankly nobody finds prayer easy. One's always striving to pray better and to not have one's brain heading in all directions. But keeping a journal, Julia Cameron in the writing stuff, she suggests doing morning pages, 3 sides of A4, just let the pen hit the page and just scribble. And it doesn't matter what you say, just let it all get out of your system. But if you go back to it every now and again, you might see threads of development and movement. Or sometimes I find with writing, if I'm just in my head, I go round in circles, but somehow there's that linear thing that when you write, you actually move on and you get out of the circle and it takes you in a direction where you might find yourself heading towards a sort of answer. And the other thing is gratitude diaries. Every day to write down 3 things for which you're grateful. And not just to say the weather, But to say, well, I saw a lovely cloud go past the window, which sort of looked like an angel while I was sitting up in the office just around the corner from Claire's. But to be very specific, and actually that too, particularly when we live in times of, there's so much negativity around. It's not to undermine the negativity, but it's to ensure that we remain rooted in the fact that life is a gift and it has the potential to be very good indeed. So there's a few of my little bits and pieces. Do you have some things you'd like to toss out there? And then we'll just do a quick summary, I think.
I think there's one invitation perhaps I'd like to offer, and that is that I think these conversations around healing, not only for ourselves, but if we're thinking about our institutions, which some of us have mentioned, that this is actually a practice that requires enormous courage as well as truthfulness. And that needs to be stated. And when I was preparing for today, and also some work I'm doing around ideas of selfhood, I was reading Audre Lorde. And these words stayed with me, and I'd like to share them now. When we speak, we are, brackets my insertion sometimes, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak. And I think around these conversations around healing, these touch on deep and difficult and unknown places, both in ourselves and when we start to do it collectively and in institutions. So the Jungian in me wants to say that those spaces that contain this process are very important, where we can do it with some degree of safety and also trust. But also it requires not only bravery, but courage to step into this. And that courage, I think, is often built by continuing to speak, even though we are afraid. But it is, in this case, often better to speak.
Thank you. Right. Kierkegaard said, life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. So I'm going to end with something from St. David himself of the 6th century in westernmost Wales. And his last teaching to his monks was this. And I think it's something that can be a spiritual compass, whatever one's faith commitments. He said, be joyful, keep the faith, do the little things that you have seen and done in me. Be joyful. That sense of gratitude, the optimism that is holy hope rather than just being wishful thinking, that generous spirited nature towards others, to draw out the best in one another, to think the best of others, not always to judge, to keep the faith, to live with integrity, authenticity, honesty, to have values and standards and stick with them as far as you can, and to do the little things, to build those persistent habits, bottom up, of kindness and attentiveness and learning to shape one's life so that you can look back and think, I was glad I made those choices, and to have that peace within oneself. Are we finished? I think we've... So thank you all very much indeed.
It's best to be by the microphone. It's best to speak even when you're afraid. My last job in the Foreign Office as a diplomat was as the head of the political section in Syria. So there's some extraordinary connections that have come out this evening. And I think as you have spoken about the opportunity to heal, the need for healing, the need to know oneself, to know who I am, the self I am, but also the self I want to be. It's a generational kind of tension that both of those truths we need to know in order to be free to do the things that begin to make for healing. Healing isn't going to happen up here. That's what I think I've learnt from our two tremendous and wonderful speakers, and the way that you as questioners and as listeners have interacted. So I want to thank very much indeed speakers, audience, our technicians and those who've helped us, please have a wonderful journey back home and use the time to think, how can we heal ourselves? Thank you.